like to thank to also Ryan and also Pak Dedi Adhuri, who will become the discussion in this in this morning discussion. So hopefully this will bring like an advantage for all of us to share not only just Ryan's perspective in his research, but also probably there will be like a new historical methods to analyze the archive, etc., that can be learned together from this forum. So I think without further ado, we can start the discussion, and I would like to give the forum back to Bung Karim. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih pada Bu Olia telah memberikan sambutannya. Ya, seperti diskusi kita pada hari ini dilaksanakan secara hybrid, ya bahasanya juga hybrid, ya Indonesia dan bahasa Inggris, ya. Ya, saya tadi mohon maaf tadi saya lupa tadi menyapa Pak Dedi sebagai salah satu narasumber kita juga. Dan untuk mengefisienkan waktu, saya langsung saja serahkan kepada moderator kita, ya peneliti muda PRMB BRIN yang sangat potensial. Ya, silakan Mas Irawan.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Karim atas kesempatannya. Perkenalkan Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, selamat pagi. Perkenalkan saya Irawan yang akan menjadi moderator untuk hari ini. Perkenalkan saya untuk berbicara dalam bahasa Inggris ya, untuk memoderatori. Yeah, okay. We will talk in English. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Forum Diskusi Budaya. So my name is Irawan. So I will be serving as your moderator for today's session. So in this edition of our sharing session, we'll be exploring research related to spices, a topic that evokes deep historical connections, but also open up discussion across disciplines such history, anthropology to ecology and archaeology and global trade. So for today, we are honored to have a speaker. So it's Dr. Ryan Dominicriu, and then one discussion, Pak Dedi Adhuri, whom I will introduce shortly before his presentation. So for first, it was my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ryan Dominicriu. He is an associate professor and chair of the history of department at the University of Colorado, Denver. So Ryan is a historian of colonial Latin America with a broader interest in early modern global world, especially the intersection between religion, empire, and indigenous agency. He received his PhD from Yale University and has published extensively on colonial Mexico, Spanish Pacific, and the early modern missionary encounters. His recent book, The Mexican Mission, published by Cambridge University Press, has received honorable mention from both the Bolton Johnson Prize and the Maria Elena Martinez Prize, prestigious recognition that highlight its significant contribution to the field. Beyond the Latin America, Ryan works also explore trans-Pacific connections, including early Spanish encounter in Southeast Asia. He has held fellowship from institutions such as Fulbright, Hayes, and Mellon Foundation, and has presented his work in academic setting across the United States, Europe, and also the Southeast Asia. So for today's session, we will discuss his ongoing project, the reason that he is here in Indonesia. So he will do some field research in the eastern part of Indonesia. The seed of all this sport, the spice wars in the global history. So seems like it will be interesting to hear more about his ongoing research, particularly if we want to do, or some of us discuss about how we can engage with the global audiences. So that's why probably your ongoing project is suitable for our discussion. So how to engage with the global, because some of our research project, its part is just like more focused on Indonesians, but then we need to broader a little bit. So that without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Dominicriu. So your time is about 30 minutes.
Okay.
So yes, time is yours.
Okay.
Yeah.
Terima kasih banyak. Bahasa Indonesia. Oh, oh. There we go. Terima kasih, Irwan. Terima kasih sudah datang. Saya tidak bisa bahasa Indonesia. Saya hanya sedang belajar. Saya bisa Indonesia sedikit, just a little. So unfortunately, I must can only give my presentation today in English. I'm learning Indonesian. Thank you everyone for joining me today, and especially my thanks to Ibu Aulia, Pak Dedi, Karim, Irawan, Ibu Lilis, my thanks for all the support here at the BRIN, and I had a wonderful discussion with the three of you last week, a wonderful discussion about colonization and history and global encounters, and the academy too, scholarship. And so I'm just very, very lucky and pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to learn from you. So thank you all for joining. My research is, as Irawan has explained very well, is looking at the trans-Pacific dimensions of the spice wars in an attempt to globalize even further a story that has been a key part of global history. I will share a screen for the rest of this presentation. I have some maps and images that would hopefully help illuminate this. What I examine is a nearly 200-year long connection, about 180-year long connection between the eastern archipelago, the eastern section of Indonesia, with, of course, the Philippines increasingly after the Spanish arrive there and begin their colonial conquests there in 1565. But really, the story goes back to a person that everyone does recognize as Magellan, right? So we start in 1521, and the Spanish, and I would argue Spanish-American engagement with Indonesia lasts until the 1670s, right? And so what we have in that period from 1520 to 1670, more or less, is a period in which Spanish colonizers in Mexico, who got incredibly wealthy from that conquest, who were able to take over entire systems of power in Mexico that were quite wealthy, then built ships and began immediately to try to make it to the Spice Islands. And that began a process that eventually led to the conquest of the Philippines, and then led to a situation in which Spain, the imperial power, was then entangled in a war in the Moluccas that lasted all the way to 1670, fighting the Dutch, of course, but also fighting the Sultanate of Ternate and various powers in Maluku. Okay, so so I'm looking at a history that runs for about 170 years, goes through several phases, and most importantly for historians, generated documents. It generated paperwork, it generated inquisition cases, money movements, mass movements of money from Latin America to Asia. And so what I'm trying to understand here is a new angle on the history of globalization. And what I find is that the struggle over the Moluccas, of course, among European powers, that's a story we relatively know, but also their entanglement in indigenous politics and indigenous struggles for power across the archipelago is itself one of the earliest truly global experiences. It's one of the earliest phases or experiences of globalization. Okay. The story normally, and I have a first map to show you here. The story of the entanglement of Latin America in Asia, and especially in the Maluku region, kind of contrasts with the normal way we understand the story of Malucan history in the Spice Wars, right? Maluku and the Spice Islands, the spice trade, the war over spices, is presented as a Eurasian story, right? It's and with good reason, obviously, throughout the period up to the 17th century, 16th century. Maluku is obviously deeply connected to the Indian Ocean world. It's connected to China. It's a Eurasian story. What is revolutionary about the period I look at is that, as you can see in this map here, after the 1520s, this is after Magellan, okay, we begin to see the arrival of, and I will use the term as Latin Americans call it, America. One quick point here. America, when we study Latin America, means the entire continent from Alaska to Patagonia. My country, the United States, appropriated that name for itself, surprise, surprise, about 100 years ago. So America, the American continent, begins to interact with Asia quite early after Magellan. And so what we see then, I would dare say for the study of Indonesia, is that we see an opening then to the east of Indonesian history, to America, from a very early time. That is to say, the Eurasian orientation of Indonesia gets complemented by, added, right, this new connection to the east of influences coming from America, and of course, vice versa. The effect of Asia, and specifically Maluku, on the formation of America, which is a story that also is not told in my continent very much. So what I'm trying to tell here is a trans-Pacific story of connections between colonial Latin America and Asia that involved decades of investment, decades of exploitation, as I'll speak about in a moment, of indigenous labor in Mexico, but also Guatemala and what is now El Salvador, all leading to the conquest of the Philippines by Legazpi in 1565, and wars that continued until 1666, 1670. Over that period, sure, it was the Spanish crown leading those wars, but it was Mexican labor, it was Mexican money, it was Mexican piloting, right, from the Mexican colony that handled a great amount of the colonial situation in the Philippines and, of course, in Maluku. What this did is it produced an immense amount of paperwork that now exists in archives in Manila, in Mexico City, and then in Seville, in Spain, the old imperial network. And what we find there in those archives, if we dig enough, is not the proclamations of powerful men, always men in this situation, commanding expeditions and doing, leading war, but finding other experiences, letters from sultans, letters and testimonies from people across the archipelago, merchants, the presence of Chinese merchants in the middle of these wars. We find Mexicans in very unlikely places, in Makassar and in Tidore, some converting to Islam, Filipinos, of course. We find Javanese, we find Achenese. We even find, according to one Spaniard, Turkish artillerymen, all the way from Turkey, handling cannons for the Sultan of Ternate. That would be about 1580. So it seems on these relatively small islands, everyone seemed to be there, people from all over the world. They appear in the records. They're ordinary people, and I think their stories are worthy to be told. Okay. There are two big angles of the story that I'll talk about now, and then I'll try to go into a little bit of detail if my time allows. just to give a sense of my angle on this. Normally, at least in like the story of Europe, this is a story that has been told, right? This is not the story of the Spice Wars is probably one of the first big stories told in the story of European imperialism, right? It ranks up there with stories from the region that I have learned to study, like the conquest of Mexico. That's another key story that Europeans told themselves as they learned and began to develop their imperial and colonial projects. If you talk about national history, and I'm glad you bring this up, in the national histories of Portugal, Spain, England, and of course Holland, right? The story that I'm trying to tell here is a core element of their national stories. Just a few years ago, the 500th anniversary of Magellan has produced a boom in books, mostly in Spain, a surge of nationalism and national pride. Of course, I'm a historian, so historians push back against these kinds of things and ask questions, which of course a nationalist history does not always really do. It can, but not always, right? And so I'm trying to move beyond the old settled narratives of four empires that are bound into this story and ask simply who else was there. And what else was there, I would say, coming from my own area of study, was the American continent, especially Mexico, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, Viceroyalty of Mexico in the 16th century. For Spaniards and people of mixed Spanish and indigenous background, the idea that they might be close to Asia. Mind you, people did not know in the 1520s exactly how wide the Pacific Ocean was. The idea that they could be so close to islands that could produce such an immense amount of wealth that you could get 1,000% profit from a set of clothes that you acquired directly in Maluku to the point of sale in Amsterdam or Lisbon. For Spaniards and their children in Mexico, this was unavoidable. They were obsessed with trying to make it to the Spice Islands just after the Spanish conquest. This means that everything about early colonization of the Americas was Asia focused. One thing about American history, both US and Latin American history, is that the assumption is everyone came to America, found La America, and said, oh, I made it. That's every American story, whether you talk about Argentina or the United States or any place. That story is false. When people arrived in Mexico, sure, they were happy to arrive in Mexico, but what they really wanted was the kind of wealth that you could get in 1530 by making it to Maluku. Hernán Cortés, the famous conquistador of Mexico City, conquered Mexico City in 1521. 3 months after conquering that city, which Europeans have been telling that story for 500 years, he sat down and wrote a letter and said, great, we conquered the city. Now I have enough money to build ships to go to the Spice Islands. This was the obsession, even for someone who conquered an entire empire. So Asia has an immense role in the making of America. Maluku has a role in the making of America. But also there is the reverse. Because Mexican ships crossed the Pacific early and began to make that journey, America changed Asia in the early modern period, most specifically through its silver mined by indigenous labor in Mexico and Peru, but also people, of course, foods and material culture. And I would say the story of the Spaniards in Mexico produced an ideology that Asians across the region in the 16th century had to contend with, had to deal with, negotiate with, or resist. And so these are the two elements, push against the imperial story and bring a little bit further the story of the New World of the American continent into this. Okay. We could ask a good question here, which is, how does a scholar of Mexican history, someone trained in this story, how does this scholar arrive here? What is a Mexicanist doing in Jakarta? As Irawan has well said, I began my career studying the colonization of Mexico. And I studied indigenous politics and indigenous economies and how these things formed part of the colonization project. One thing that I noticed early on in the archive is that people began to disappear after a certain few years, and they would reappear in another side of that archive in the section that deals with Philippines or Asia. And so I got curious about these things. The next thing that happened is I was looking through the archives of the Inquisition, and found a case, this is now 16 years ago, of a Moluccan prince who had to flee the islands, joined the Spanish army, ended up in Manila, faced an accusation of illegally practicing Islam in Manila, was brought before the Inquisition. The Inquisition charged him because he was baptized, and for trial took him all the way to Mexico. So the journey of this prince from Tidore brought all the way to Mexico City. I read the file and my jaw dropped. I had to get an atlas and begin tracing his movements. And I could say that I am here because of one case that I read 16 years ago. It opened up many questions about how is it possible that this person's life could connect with Mexico City on the other side of the planet, almost at the antipode of here, and end up there. And so then over the next 10 years, over the past decade, I've been working on the connections between colonial Latin America and Asia. I've worked quite a bit on Manila. And increasingly now, of course, my main project now is Maluku and the connections across the Pacific. Okay. To illustrate why I found that record, and then began to find many more records. I have records, I spoke a few days ago with Karim about records that I have on Makassar, for example, that were sitting in a Mexican archive for 400 years, and were discovered in a kind of cleanup of the Mexican archive just 10 years ago, produced about 500,000 pages of new material, and there a lot of records on Makassar, Ambon, Ternate, Tidore, Siao, other places. The reason why those records were there can be explained with this picture, this map. What you can see here are the main circuits of the Spanish Empire after about 1565. The Spanish Empire basically had two circular movements of annual fleets, one from Spain and the Caribbean, and the other between Mexico, Acapulco, and Manila. You can see from this picture that the center of the Spanish Empire is not Madrid, it is not Seville, it is Mexico City, it's in the middle. The best information about Asia in the Spanish imperial period, okay, you could find plenty of information in a good monastery in Spain, but there was an immense amount of direct knowledge of Asia among people who lived in Mexico City because they did business in Asia, or they had connections, trading connections in Asia. So the paper literally arrived in Mexico, and often simply because it's too much to ship it again, it would stay in Mexico, the paperwork. And so the Mexican archives have a good amount of material about early modern Indonesia, especially Eastern Indonesia. Of course, an immense amount of material on the Philippines, Cambodia, Siam, China, and Japan, and even a bit towards India as well. So there's quite a bit of material that actually landed in Mexico. And one of the things that we talk about, we've talked about, and you mentioned as well, is the idea that national history sometimes closes us off from the outside. The reason why we didn't know these stories existed and were buried in the Mexican archive is because Mexican history looks at Mexico, right? Understandably, most of the papers are about Mexico, right? Just like here, most of the papers would be about Indonesia. But it's these outlier records, right, that you find that are interesting and open questions, and they open doors to new things. Going back further, why Mexico again? Why were people in Mexico, especially Spaniards, interested in Maluku in the 16th century? This map explains a bit. There was a group of conquistadors, settlers, and their children, okay, who were obsessed with the idea of reaching Maluku first, before other Europeans, to fight the Portuguese there, of course, but also to beat other Spaniards. They were competing, of course, with Spaniards in Spain. And this map illustrates what they thought, or at least hoped, could be true. The idea was that the Pacific might have been very broad at the bottom. Magellan found that out the hard way, of course, but that at the top, in the north, that Mexico perhaps might just be an extension of Asia. There was a theory in the 1520s and 30s that perhaps if you just walk far north enough from Mexico, you'll arrive in Beijing. The discovery of California occurred because of this. And further south, the idea was, how close are we to Maluku? Well, here in 1544, this map, produced by an Italian map maker, but based on information from Mexico, from informants in Mexico. This map illustrates, I think, perfectly that hope. Not far from Baja California, you can find a clump of trees to the west. That clump of trees represents the spice forest, the clove forests of Ternate and Tidore. If I focus in further, you can see how close Maluku is to Mexico in 1544, just around the corner. Now, here's the truth. As this map was being made, people already suspected that the voyage would be a little bit harder than appears on this map. In fact, there were already 2 failed expeditions there. The Magellan expedition already proved how far away it was. So what this also could be is a kind of stubborn attempt by Spaniards based in Mexico to insist that, no, Maluku really is close, it will be easy, we're the ones who should be carrying this out. What this leads to then is a series of expeditions across the Pacific Ocean. And on the other side of the Pacific, in Maluku, the Portuguese, who were already based in Ternate already for about 30 years, the Portuguese were very concerned because they also were not confident that they were very far from Mexico. After all, the Spanish crown and Portugal, as you can see here in this map, were disputing a very imperial a division of the world. Of course, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which infamously divided the world in 2 between the Portuguese half and the Spanish half. Classic imperial gaze here, right? Classic imperial vision of things. And because then both sides began reaching the other side of the world, of course, Maluku being in the crosshairs of both, they had to negotiate a treaty once again to divide the world on the Pacific side. And where Maluku fell, whether it was in the Spanish part or the Portuguese part, was very much under doubt and producing an immense amount of conflict. The Mexican contingent in the Spanish Empire pushed very hard for the idea that the Pacific is small and Maluku is very much Spanish. It will be in the Spanish part. This is classic imperial history. We open any book on the Spice Wars in the 16th and 17th centuries, we encounter this line, and then we begin to learn about how Europeans began to fight brutally over these islands. What I'm interested in is the backstory here. In the 1520s and 30s, Mexican indigenous and Guatemalan indigenous people were forced to build ships and build European-style ships, some of the most complicated technology that Europeans had, already being produced by indigenous peoples in Mexico. My first part of this project already is dealing with that, based on work I did last year. Those expeditions sailed across the Pacific Ocean and began to get embroiled in wars in Maluku, Spanish versus Portuguese. These wars were illegal because Spain had, in this Treaty of 1529, said, we will not go into Maluku. Maluku can remain Portuguese under lease until we figure out where it stands. The Mexican contingent didn't have time for that. They sent their expeditions anyway and got embroiled in wars. Once they arrived in the region, in the island of Sarangani, which is just south of Mindanao, the Portuguese sent an expedition and ambassadors to Spain, and we had a ridiculous scene which I saw recorded in an archive in a document that's held in Lisbon, of the two sides sitting on a beach in Sarangani, issuing legal contestations against each other over the possession of Maluku. So it was a ridiculous scene. These two men, right, arguing over islands on the opposite side of the world that they have no hope to truly control, and simply arguing over their legal standing. What is fascinating about that moment is who was there also watching this. 3 representatives from Ternate were present. They stayed quiet, they watched the entire thing unfold. They went back and informed the Sultan as to what was taking place. The various groups in Maluku were paying attention, of course, the entire time about the various European groups that arrived. And while Ternate in the 1540s was kind of held captive by the Portuguese, there were plenty of other powers in Maluku that were free enough from the Portuguese that they allied with the Spanish. And we end up with the Great War between Spanish allied groups and Portuguese allied groups in Maluku. What we have then unfolding is something that is not a European demarcation of Maluku. It's a Malucan demarcation of Maluku, in the sense that Europeans are not powerful enough at this time to truly have control over anything in this situation. It is Malucan powers that are sorting out who is the more powerful European power, who's the weaker power, and enough powers then ally with the weaker power, the Spanish, to try and push back against the Portuguese. This was a classic set of relations that goes on in Maluku all the way through until at least the 1640s, once the Dutch get stronger in the region after that. But this is a dynamic for 100 years where the Malucans are playing different powers off against each other. I can see this unfolding in the documents, and in some ways, as a person who has been trained in indigenous history in the Americas, I have to be careful, obviously, I'm in a different region, but I can see what's going on. This is precisely what took place in the borderlands of North America in the 17th century, between the Spanish and French and Spanish and the British. Various indigenous powers in what is now Texas, or where I'm from, where California, Colorado, New Mexico, are playing powers against each other all the time. And so there is a similar dynamic seems to be taking place. And so, like I say, instead of grounding the story in this map, the story of a European division of the world, which was a fiction, right? What is really happening here is a Malucan demarcation of Europeans, figuring out how to divide them, set them against each other, and when necessary, ally, even across rivalries, against a more powerful power. We see this take place in the 1570s and 80s in Maluku, of course, with the Great Rebellion against the Portuguese, the expulsion of the Portuguese from Ternate under Sultan Bahabullah. And so in this period, we see a constant reconfiguration of power, and the people who are reconfiguring the power is very often, most of the time, Malucans trying to pit one power against the other. That is the big story that I would like to tell in the first phase of this project. This first phase is pre-Dutch. The Dutch arrive about a decade later. But the first phase will start with these first expeditions after Magellan. I won't talk about Magellan too much, to be honest. I'll get to the Mexican expeditions and move it and close with Sultan Ba'abullah and the Ternatan rebellion. The second phase, which will take longer, is very rich, but I will be doing like a micro histories, very specific stories from 17th century Maluku, from the Spanish forts there, and see that. My goals, yeah, I'm going to wrap up now. My goals in Indonesia. I am very new to the study of Indonesia, of Indonesian history. I know that it takes time to absorb historiography, perspectives, etc. So I believe in going slowly. I have documents I can share. I have documents I can study from my own expertise. I don't intend to really write too much until I have better experience in Indonesia. I'm learning Bahasa as much as I can. I hope to be able to read the historiography, Indonesian historiography of maritime history, hopefully within a year, we'll see. And then my intention is to come back next year for a longer period through the entire summer next year, to begin to get a sense of oral histories, to get a sense of what this story means in Ternate, what this story means in Tidore, in Makassar, Ambon, and to conduct extensive site visits. I will do some now, but I will do more also next year. And finally, the longer-term goal is I'm gathering sources from Mexican archives, Philippine archives, of course, Spanish archives, about Indonesia, and my idea is to share this with anyone who is interested here, and to begin to open up these doors, as we say, to understand the global history of this story. I'm kind of the global history of Mexico and Philippines and Maluku. Indonesia is an ideal site to understand global history. Maluku in the 16th century, like Mexico in the 16th century, what I find similar about these two very different places is that this is a place where we could learn more about indigenous methodologies. These are places, some of the first to undergo early modern colonization. They both faced, in the same decades, right? Iberian capitalism, Iberian colonial wars. They began to develop new forms of resistance based on what they learned from these encounters, indigenous peoples. And of course, the commodification of the environment, both in Latin America, but also in Maluku. And with all of this, the big idea is to kind of go beyond, or at least test the boundaries of area studies. I was trained as a Latin Americanist. I teach 20th century Latin America mostly on my day job. Yeah. But I see so many connections across the world. It's important for us to understand regional boundaries, right? Southeast Asia, Latin America, etc. But also these boundaries can be entrapping, right? And so projects like this, I seek to try and break a little bit the barriers between their area studies so that we can see new connections across the globe. So thank you once again. I'm sorry for going over. And thank you. Yes, yeah. Terima kasih banyak. Okay, let me stop the share. Where is the stop share? There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Ryan, thank you very much for quite interesting presentations. Just when I heard you said about there's a lot of connections across the world, and then in my mind, I just wondering is the distinction between the national history and also the global history is still relevant or not? I mean,
yeah,
if needed or not. I mean, is it the time for us to see more outward instead of inward? So it's quite interesting because Mexico and Molucca is quite far away, and we still can find that kind of connection. That's quite surprising.
Yeah.
So, I mean, also the period that you are now investigating is it's quite interesting. I mean, in the perspective of history of knowledge, this time is the exploration period where the European do the exchanges more probably because the colonialism had not established yet. So it's quite equal exchange. They try to fill their cabinet of curiosity with some exchanges with the local people, something like that.
Yeah.
So this is quite interesting. But I think it's not my job to elaborate more about that. I will leave it to our discussion today. It's Pak Dedi Adhuri. So I will introduce you all to Pak Dedi. So Pak Dedi, hold on. So it's my pleasure to introduce our discussion, Pak Dr. Dedi Adhuri. So he is a leading anthropologist over 3 years of experience researching social conflict, marine resource governance, fisheries, indigenous communities, and post-disaster coastal rehabilitation in Indonesia. His fieldwork spans across diverse regions from Maluku and Papua to Aceh, Bali, and Lombok. So it's demonstrating a deep long-standing engagement with coastal societies. He earned his PhD from Australian National University and has held fellowship at several institutions such as Wageningen University in Netherlands, Kyoto Research Institute, and many more. So he also served now as a coordinator of Maritime Study Group of the Research Center for Society and Culture, BRIN. He has a long list of publications, but one that worth to mention is his influential book, The Sailing the Sea, Fishing for Power, a study of conflict over marine tenure in the K Island, Eastern Indonesia, published by the Australia National University e-Press. So without further ado, I will please join me in welcoming Pak Dedi Adhuri. So your time is more or less 30 minutes, Pak Dedi, untuk mengelaborasi apa yang sudah tadi disampaikan oleh Ryan. Time is yours, Pak Dedi, silakan.
Terima kasih Mas Irwan. Thank you for having me here, and sorry for Ryan and all of you that I cannot attend the discussion in person in BRIN office in Gatot Subroto. I am having a workshop in Semarang at the moment. Yeah, I actually prepared a PowerPoint, but it's only some pointers for my talk, so it's not funny or fancy PowerPoint as Ryan has prepared and show us. So I don't want to share the PowerPoint with the share screen. Just read it over as I speak. So first of all, I would like to kind of give an introduction of context of how I read Ryan's proposal. Yeah, so this is my talk is based on my reading on Ryan's proposal as well as his presentations just now. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm not a historian. So I come across history usually or use history for explaining contemporary realities. So I use history to sometimes talk about the remains of the historical events, but also mostly the impacts of historical events to the current realities, particularly since my specialties, my work focuses more on maritime issues. So I use the history in terms of explaining the maritime realities of Indonesia particularly. Well, being not as a historian, so I have a limited knowledge on the deep history of the spice routes. But I did a research on coastal traditional marine resource management across Malukus in different places in Malukus, including the Banda Islands. So my reading on Ryan proposal and also the talk we just heard now is based on that limited knowledge of mine. However, I'm also kind of in the last 5 years also try to get involved in the discourse of the spice routes, particularly in Indonesian context, by promoting or adding maritime commodities in the discourse of the spice routes. I believe that the discussion of the spice routes should not only focus on the spice as we understand now, that's the cloves and nutmeg and so on, but also other commodities that at the end it triggered or stimulate the connections, the establishment of maritime connections, maritime routes, and also connections of different people coming from different region in the globe, as well as the establishment of the diasporas communities, as well as hybrid communities in different places that is triggered by, the exploitations and trade of particular communities. In that context, I'm trying to promote to include maritime commodities, particularly the things that I have been working on quite a lot is the tripang or sea cucumbers, which is interestingly, I think it's another history of the spice route, the history of spice route without the colonialisms. So it's different genre of discussing spice route, which is for me it's quite interesting, but because it does not the talk of spice route is not necessarily deal with or talk about the European, particularly colonialisms. If we are talking about the tripang or sea cucumber, we can see the connections of various people living in different sides of the world, particularly Australia, Asia, and Australia, Indonesian archipelago, as well as China, by which the relations take the form of a kind of relatively harmonious compared with the history of mainstream of the spice route, which more or less the history of Western colonialism. So that is more or less the background of how I read Ryan's proposal, research. So in that context, I read that Ryan tried to investigate the spice wars in Maluku, 1520, 1670s, as part of the early globalizations. It focuses on indigenous agency and cultural mestizaje. This is the thing that I like a lot about his proposal and his approach to the issues that he's trying to address. And he's going to also use global microhistory and archival materials in question of trials and petitions in trying to unearth the history of the Spanish, particularly Mexico, in the globalization that nested in Maluku in the 16th to 17th century, and also highlights Maluku's as a central role in the Trans-Pacific trade. So this is the thing that I like and I highlighted that I understand, and I understand what Rian is going to work on in his research. Now, as a anthropologist, I also mentioned earlier that I use history to explain the contemporary realities, particularly in Indonesia. So when we are talking about the history that Rians want to cover, I would like also to see how he deals with the history in explaining the contemporary nature or dynamics, sociocultural and political dynamics in Indonesia. For me, for example, I wonder if when he's talking about the uh, Indonesian context, political context during the first interaction, the Spanish and Mexico, for example, he will also look at it represent in its reflections to Indonesian contemporary situation. For example, he will also deals with looking at it as, for example, uh, how the spice routes and the spice wars created a kind of loss of old traditions in Maluku and also particularly in Banda, where the genocide took place, led by the VOC at the time. How this war caused the loss of old traditions in that particular place, and also looking at in the context of modern realities now, the problems of the construction of the new traditions, which was re-established or established by the new arrival brought by the Dutch, for example, in this context, after the genocide of the Banda people. The VOC brought people from outside of the Banda to replace the people of Banda who was driven away or killed working for pala plantations. And also, I wonder if he would like also to see. He actually, I see seemingly that in his last slide, he would like also to look at the dynamics of local politics, in response to the arrival of the Western colony, particularly in this context, Spanish. What I see now, for example, in Ambon, this can be in the island of Ambon or Central Maluku in general, the serious impact of this history is the conflict over the traditional territory of the people. When the Western power came in and tried to control the people, they pushed the people to stay on the coastal area, which left their original territory. This creates a serious conflict later on up to now about the boundaries of traditional territory. Now we have also witnessed the conflict over the traditional leadership. In 2010, for example, the Central Maluku district government issued local regulations that states that the village organization should go back to the traditional system or traditional governance system. The problem is when they trace back the history, there are some kind of uncertainty which point of history that should be traced back to decide who is legally has the right to sit in the leadership position as Raja, for example. That kind of dynamics, political dynamics in contemporary Maluku is very much influenced by the history, the history of which is strongly affiliated with the wars on over the spice, I think. So that is the thing I would like to see Rian address in his studies. I mean, that means that he is not only talking about the history as it is, as things of the past, but also looking at the contemporary implications of that history, of that events, of that dynamics. I think that's more or less my reading and my comment. The things that I would like to add as the last part of my comment is that I wonder if he is also interested to look at the oral history of the people, either on the history of the Spanish connections or the oral history related to the political dynamics of the people, the establishment of the community, which somehow relates to the 16th and 17th century, but still its impact can be seen to the current conditions in that community, as well as I believe the oral history can be used as a means to understand how the people consider the history, the events in the past, but also in the context of contemporary Maluku now, as I explained in the for example conflict over territory, territorial boundaries, or conflict over the positions of Raja, use that history, the oral history, for the contemporary territorial claim as well as political claims as political leaders. I think I should stop there. Looking forward to Ryan's comment as well as discussion from audience. Thank you.
Baik, Pak Dedi, thank you very much for the reading or the input or comments about the ongoing project of Ryan's. Before we go to the Q&A sessions, I just want to give some time to Ryan if there are any comments about what already been said by Pak Dedi.
Thank you so much, Pak Dedi, for your comments. Yes, I'm really interested in expanding the concept of what spice is, what denotes spice, and who's moving these commodities. One really fascinating connection that I keep finding, both from my documents on Manila and then of course on Maluku, are the presence of what were called in Manila sanglays, Chinese merchants based mostly in Manila, but also Cebu, who had networks all through the Eastern Archipelago. So I'm really interested. I'm digging. I would like to find more documents on that, because I find sanglays, Chinese of Manila, moving between the opposing camps and opposing sultanates all the time. In fact, there was I recall one record where there was one side of Ternate, there was a Spanish settlement, a Spanish fort, and the Dutch fort was a kilometer away. There was war between these two, and in the middle there was a Chinese settlement between those two forts. In the middle of the war, trading with both sides. So there's these are wonderful ways to lighten and reduce the weight of European history when we find groups like this. And of course, there are plenty of things crossing the Pacific Ocean to Asia. Everyone loves chocolate, of course, but the Chabay, I'm interested in the story of Chiles, and the movement of Mexican Chiles across Pacific and their distribution through Asia. So these are all things I would love to work with you on. I really appreciate your insight into this project from your perspective as an anthropologist. I would very much like to try and begin to understand both oral history or memories of this period, 16th and 17th centuries. In part, that's why I see this as a long-term project, because I want to at least have enough Indonesian to be able to do this work realistically with the help of someone who could translate for me in the actual interviews. But I want to have enough Indonesian to at least get a better sense of things, and if I can, to speak it well. That's my goal, and to increasingly engage. Yeah, it is my goal to do an oral history and to understand memory. And your points about the contemporary context remind me so much again of why we need to push against area studies a little bit. So many of the themes that you bring up about indigenous rights, about customs, about the really difficult question of who has the right to claim either territory or authority, and which set of remembered customs is a community going to settle on and agree to abide by after so much destruction, right, of the colonial period, after so much loss. How do you recover, and on whose terms is the recovery done, and who is able then to be the accepted authority over local traditional systems? These are questions that my colleagues in Latin America study, of course, every day. I immediately wrote down the word, as you mentioned this, the Maya people, the indigenous people of Guatemala, whose ancestors built the ships that took the first expeditions to Maluku from Mexico, hauling gigantic hardwood trees for 100 kilometers and then building European ships. They also have the same questions right now. Right? They have the same struggles and the same questions. Different contexts, of course, very different. I understand, say, in the history of Ambon, very difficult history, especially in recent times. Things get complex, but the underlying themes here, some of the underlying questions that you bring up here, lead me to think that this is something that I would like to do both for the Eastern Archipelago, but also for communities that I've already written about on the other side of the Pacific. And that way we can start thinking about what indigeneity is across contexts, and understand these processes in a global perspective. I'm very much interested in that too. So thank you for raising that. As a historian, honestly, it will take me time, and I need to learn to speak Bahasa Indonesia properly. So it will take time, but I hope to get there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan, for the comment or response to Pak Dedi. So now I will open the Q&A sessions. You can directly raise your hand and ask to Ryan or Pak Dedi, or you can put or write it on and drop it on the chat box. So please, ladies and gentlemen, jika ada pertanyaan, kalau misalnya nanti nggak nyaman dengan bahasa Inggris dan pertanyaan untuk Ryan, nanti bisa saya translatekan. So if there's audience that want to ask in bahasa Indonesia, so I will just translate it to you. Oh ya, bentar. Baik, yang pertama ada Pak Agus Heri Pak Agus Hadi Purnomo, silakan. Setelah Pak Dedi nanti Pak Agus, Bu Dian ya. Silakan Pak Agus.
Terima kasih, Mas Irawan. Like Pak Dedi, I think I'm really interested in the what you say, Pak Dedi, complementary context implication. So really, I have been thinking about how the historical stories shared by you, Pak Ryan, could be applied in ways that benefit Indonesia today, especially considering that Indonesia today remains one of the world's key spice producer. Now we are number 5. India is number 1, right? So, in your opinion, can spices still be used as a tool of diplomacy or a form of cultural strength, if you will, on the global stage? So, how can the historical perspective, like you just presented earlier, be translated into what you call it, concrete strategies relevant to Indonesia today? Thank you very much.
You want to directly answer the question? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. These are mostly questions that I myself am asking. So as a historian, we start in the old things and then move forward for the contemporary context. So I don't know yet. I don't know enough about contemporary Indonesia to know the how this plays to concrete strategies. What is for sure, perhaps in a narrow way, is this history can at least start a conversation between parts of the world that might not have as much contact. There is interest, a tremendous amount of interest in Mexico, in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. To put it very, how would I say, superficially, there's a love of spice in Mexico. So, and food is a conversation starter. Commodities are a starter as well for greater context. So I don't diminish the power of cultural knowledge and history, obviously, in building stronger relations about many other things. In fact, I believe in it. This is what I do. But I also myself, regarding Indonesia, am just learning. I am only learning now. So I hope it will have a concrete that these studies that many people are doing will help raise consciousness, maybe that we're not all just in our little localities or in our nations, but that we're all connected. These stories, we've been connected for a very long time, and that these are reasons why we need to keep studying these stories to continue these connections, expand these connections. That's my thought. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. Pak Agus Hadi. Bu Dian, you can ask the questions directly to Ryan.
Test. How is my sound, Pak Irawan?
All good.
Okay, terima kasih. Hello, Ryan. I'm not far from you. I'm over here on Bali. I lived in Colorado for a while. So, salam Pak Dedi. I have a question that I often ask to historians, because I'm also not a historian, but I'm very interested in how humans move through the world, coming from a background of dance and art and pathways and architecture. But I'm curious about, there seems to be a great plethora of histories about power, and he writes hak and kekuasaan. But I haven't read very many current histories looking at the question of love or pathways of ties of friendship. So my question is actually very close to Pak Agus, because I feel somehow that humanity is in great need and really longing to also hear about positive matters, creative matters, and also kajian cinta, kajian kasih sayang. So I'm just curious, both Ryan and Dedi, if you have any inspiration about that, or maybe you can stimulate how some of the younger researchers here can think along those lines. Terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Bu Dian. Mungkin ke Pak Ryan first and then Pak Dedi to respond.
Thank you very much, Diane. Yeah, unfortunately, historians, we can be very gloomy. We're a little gloomy sometimes, but and it's the documents that make us gloomy. But we can find the details of what you are talking about. We can find often between the lines the ways in which people collaborated, the ways in which people are inventive and creative, in these encounters. And of course, found friendship and love and support across cultures. So even in, what I'm surprised at is even in a place that is as challenging as, say, Ternate in the 1570s, or the place that I wrote my book about, indigenous villages in Mexico that lost 90% of their population in just 70 years due to war and disease. What always strikes me is that we do find this even in those situations, right? That we do find creativity, we do find support, we do find cross-cultural understanding, even in those darkest of places. And that is, I agree with you, that is a story I think that we need to tell in this century. There is much about what we are studying, I think, in this early period that we might really need to draw lessons from in this coming century, in the next decades, because these are societies that dealt with near collapse, they dealt with existential problems, and yet they were creative. They learned to speak with each other. Yeah, I agree with you completely. You're inspiring me to look very carefully for this in the documents, and to also try not to be so gloomy as a historian, because we go straight there. Thank you.
Pak Dedi, is there any comment or try to respond to Bu Dian question?
Ya, terima kasih. Terima kasih, Bu Dian. Yeah, I think I don't write it explicitly like that, but my aims at promoting Tripang heritage, I think somehow has kind of that notions, yeah. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, that it does not involve colonialisms, controlling people in terms of governing power or enriching their resources, yeah. Sorry, I should start from saying that what I mean by Tripang heritage that I have been talking about is the connections of Indonesian people with the Australian Northern Territory started in the 18th or 17th centuries, which actually lasted until now, the relations, but physical relations ended in 1907, where the Australian modern state prohibited Indonesian boats to get into the Australian continent. So the direct connection between the Indonesian fishers and the Australian Aborigines stopped at that point. But until now, the Indonesian fishing in Australian zone is still happening, and unfortunately, is considered as illegal. Interesting things is that now in Australia, they are trying to uh, voicing this story, this heritage, by arguing that this history was marked by a good relations between Indonesian fishers and the Australian Aborigines, particularly in the north coast of Australia. That's one. Secondly, this is a tricky thing because it's taken to the political identity of the Australian Aborigine. This history show the fact that the Australian Aborigine was not isolated people before the arrival of the white Australians. This history also used by the academicians to what do you call it, to promote or to revise the dominant narrative of Australian history, which is dominated by the arrival of the white Australians, to dig more deep into the history of the Australian Aborigine, which was not isolated people. So, and also, if you look at in Indonesia, for example, the network still exists now. Bajo is everywhere in Eastern Indonesia, and their connections and also intermarriage between the maritime ethnic group of Indonesia, Bajo, Bugis, Buton, Makassar, with indigenous local people in Rote, for example, and other part that are part of that networks, showing the pluralisms, the collaborations between different ethnic groups, between communities, among even different communities in Indonesia to support that kind of endeavor. Yeah. So I'm trying to put that into a kind of central narrative about spice route, not only talking in the context of the dominant narrative, no, that is the colonial, colonialization, but also there are some elements that show this kind of explorations, exploitations, connection can also take the form as a harmonious, collaborative relations. I hope that's answer your questions.
Terima
Okay.
kasih. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Dedi. So we move forward. There's two questions on the chat box. I will just read it to you, Ryan and Pak Dedi. So this question is from Nurfianto. The first question is, how did the spice wars that occurred during the 14th and 15th centuries influence the initiation of forced cultivation practice, such as the perkenir in several islands in the Maluku regions and kultur stelsel in Java? That's the first question. And then the second one, how has the history of spice wars impact social change in farmers to this day, both among indigenous communities who have traditionally cultivated nutmeg and cloves and among nutmeg and cloves farmers in Maluku today? I think if you want to respond to the questions, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, these are two really excellent questions that I hope to learn in this project. The forced cultivation is a fascinating story because we see we don't see this under the Portuguese or the Dutch, or the Spanish. The Portuguese didn't have the power to really command land, right, and command the point of production. So what the Portuguese did is they acted like receiving tribute, as they were, they put themselves in a tribute economy and expected tribute from the various islands. It doesn't matter how the island of Bachan engages in this cultivation, whether they do it from a cultivated orchard, a plot, or go into the forest. As long as they produce so many bahars or established weights, they're good. If not, then there is trouble, right? The Portuguese will make war and all of this. So it's a tribute economy. The Spanish wanted to set up a tribute economy as well. And the Spaniards were quite, you could say, successful at noticing what an indigenous tribute economy is and then taking it over. That's the whole story of Latin America, is that, right? Spaniards were not incredibly creative. The Dutch, and we see this transition over the 17th century, of course, and of course after the genocide in Banda especially, are now seeking to control the point of production and then beginning to bring slavery into the situation as well. That's a lesson from the Atlantic world, right? That's a lesson from the Americas that they're bringing over and applying an American model of commodity production to Indonesia. It's the same as the sugar model that the Spanish are doing successfully in Latin America. So the Dutch apply a plantation model from the Atlantic based on slavery and begin that process. So I'm really interested in that transition, right? How is it that Maluku transitions from a tribute economy to a plantation, almost Atlantic style system? And there's much that I have yet to learn, especially on the Dutch side of that story. That is something that I do want to understand. Regarding the impact on farmers, this is related to Pak Dedi's suggestions and my own interest in oral history. That's an excellent question, and that is something I would add to my questionnaire once I begin field work next year and trying to engage with oral history and memory. These are important questions. So far, I'm only stuck like a historian in the documents, but I'm very interested in that aspect as well. So thank you.
Pak Dedi, silakan. Do you have any want to add something to answer these two questions from Nurfianto?
Saya tidak punya komen terkait dengan pertanyaan itu, tapi saya mau balik lagi ke ini, masih justru yang menarik, bahasa. Yang menarik dari Ryan ini dia mau belajar masa transisi ya, dari Spanish dan Portugal kolonialisme ke Belanda ya, zaman VOC. Dan nah, menurut saya ini justru masa yang menarik kalau kita ingin memahami tekanan terhadap kebudayaan dan juga sistem pemerintahan tradisional, karena Spanish yang Portugal itu seperti just Ryan said, that they didn't get into controlling the territory. Yeah, they get involved in tradisi upeti ya, tapi dia tidak mengontrol produksi, just monopoly, trade monopoly. So they didn't really impact the traditional power, yeah, as it was Dutch colonial, which also involved in taking over the land and controlling the production system. So that period is very crucial in understanding what was the real culture, indigenous culture of the Maluku before being distracted seriously by the Dutch colonialism. I think that part is very important. If we go back to the questions of Harry earlier, what is the contribution of this study? Yeah, I think the understanding of that transition, hopefully then with that, Ryan can dig up some information of what is the natures of indigenous control to the land, as well as the in original social structure, governance system, before they were distracted, and the process of distractions by the Dutch, and the current impact to that. So yeah, maybe I just add that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Dedi. Is there any questions from the audiences?
Yes, I would like to say.
Pak Herman?
Thank you, Pak Irawan, as moderator. Yeah, thank you with your presentation, Pak Rian. I would like to share in context of two significant issue. First, we say from the preaching, it's a sociological perspective. In Islamic, we can say da'wah, Islamic preaching. At the time, the history of the Ternate and Tidore as kingdom, it is very significant as the rule of the power at the time. You know, the Tidore spread Islamic spotting by the Jawa ulama or scientists, or maybe Minangkabau. They spread as the basic of the kingdom to the north, as to the north part, for example, to the Mindanao, and also to the Papua. At the time, as big kingdom, Ternate almost conquer many in the time in the golden era, 16th up to 17th century. So by preaching of da'wah, I think the assimilation and the pluralism of society also occurred in the Mindanao. And Mindanao at the time spread by da'wah, by Ternate kingdom, spotting by the Jawa and by Minangkabau, established the kingdom in the southern part. I was ever there in Mindanao, I went there, and Sultan Kadarat area, and also many part of the Mindanao. I saw the Malay as the archipelago, archipelago language. Malay, Malay, Melayu, sebagai bahasa persatuan, ya, as the united, Malay as the united. And in the middle, in the Cebu area, Cebu also in the time conquered with the Islamic kingdom in the time, and also in the northern, I mean in Luzon area. So this is the significant connecting from the perspective sociological by Da'wah Islam as the united for the assimilation and also for the united and also for the pluralism. This perspective. I agree with Pak Dedi comment just now, spice commodity. Spice commodity, it is also tool of the many actors, especially Western, yeah, Portuguese and Spain, because while I was visited in Maluku, in Banda, for example, in Maluku, yeah, in Banda, and also in near Ambon, and near, I mean, surrounding area, there are many ports established by Portuguese. This is telling us, or indicated for us, that before Dutch, Portuguese is the power, and also the colonies power who run are to take over a spice commodity. In a time, power relating to the, I mean, accumulation of wealth, to be rich, I mean, to be rich imperialism, Portuguese. Spain in the time, yeah, was colonized and fight from the 16th century up to the 17th, 18th century in the north. I mean, in the Mindanao and almost in Philippines and Spain in the time. But finally, Dutch as the winner, I mean, of the economic, politic competition as the winner. I mean, to concur with the space commodity. I mean, Dutch. Yeah, Dutch, and finally also conquer British. Yeah, British also in of the pala. I mean, commodity of the pala, vanille, and pepper and cloth. Yeah, in Maluku, especially pala in Banda. We say that British also win. I mean, over Dutch. This is some kind of the political constellation. So it is a very interesting. What I would like to recommend you by two step of the approach. First dakwah, and first dakwah, I mean the assimilation from the perspective sociological, and the second by the economic, political, what you say, commodity, spice commodity. This is kind of maybe very interesting for discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Herman. Ryan, want to comment about, especially about this approach, new approach, by looking toward the preaching, something like that.
Yes, thank you very much, Herman. I am also interested in these connections to Mindanao. Also, Mindanao has much information in Spanish archives all the way through this period. And in the time that I'm looking at in Ternate, and the wars in Ternate and Tidore, Ternate, as you mentioned, is very influential throughout the island in Mindanao. And the Spanish are constantly trying to make a war on the Malay networks in that area to cut the networks and cut communication between Mindanao and Borneo, and of course with Ternate. So I am very interested. The resistance in Mindanao goes all the way up to the U.S. occupation, right? 1912, right? So it is a very long history. I also, yes, am interested in this commodity history, and also the way there is also a story here. There's so many stories here. The story of the expansion of preachers is contemporaneous with the arrival of the Portuguese and Spanish, and so the spread of Islamic preachers from Jawa and other places, Aceh as well, is contemporaneous with the arrival of the Portuguese and Spanish, and of course with their missionaries. And so there are many missionary documents, especially by Jesuits, but also Augustinian and Dominican, who write back about preaching activities, because of course they're competing in their messaging. And so the entire bureaucracy of the missionary project of the Christians, the Catholic Church, also is writing up kind of, you could call it intelligence reports about the movement of preachers from Java and Aceh, this area. So I'm also very interested in the way in which religion overlaps with trade, and of course, going back to my comment to Diane, in spite of the divisions we can assume between these two religious groups, on the ground they were actually very interdependent, and that's a key story too. So it's very interesting. So thank you. Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. Is there any or another question from the audience before we go forward to the so-called like concluding remarks from Pak Dedi and also Ryan? No? Oh yeah. Bu Harfiah, silakan.
Oke, terima kasih. Just a quick question. I read a book by Anthony Pagden. I don't know if, yeah, The Fall of Natural Man, and he's basically talk about the paradigmatic concept of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, and I just kind of wonder whether, yeah, I mean, he's talking when he talk about the reason the Victoria and the Las Casas went to the other parts of the world. Do you think that in the case of Ternate and Tidore, there is what is it, stock differences, for example? I mean, concerning the question of Pak Herman regarding the religion, because yeah, Pagden talks about the gospel sides of the reasons why they initially conduct the voyage. So, do you think that, echoing what Pak Herman has already asked, because yeah, Tidore and Ternate has a very different kind of belief system, or let's say religion, or how the religion spread there. And another question, I've been wondering, because since the gospel play a crucial part in colonialism, I just wonder whether because most of the Spanish colony and Portuguese colony, they convert into Christianity. And do you think, but yeah, it is the Christianity itself, it's used by the colonizer to justify their colonialism. So do you think that after colonialism in today's context, do you think it helps the people, the colonized people, to be more critical of their religion? I mean, in the sense that, I mean, of course, the thing very close to us, as Diane have said, love and stuff. I mean, religion teach love, but today probably the part of the religion is replaced by the government. And the government should play actually the love things, the love part. I mean, to develop people, to improve people. But do you think that the colonialism experience helped them to be more critical of something which use as a justification for repressing them again in this today's context? Thank you. Sorry if hopefully my question is clear.
Thank you so much. I love Anthony Pagden's work. He studies the ideas of colonization in early America among the Spanish and a bit Portuguese. So yes, Vitoria and Las Casas. The way Ternate and Tidore fit into Spanish ideas about non-Europeans is really interesting, because the Spanish are completely confused. The Spanish have two legal categories about what an other is. And it all relates on the relationship to the idea, the gospel, okay? So there are populations that know about Christ, and then there are populations that do not know about Christ. And so everyone in America, all the indigenous peoples of America, were called Indians because they said, oh, well, they've never heard of Jesus Christ, right? And so that's a different law. that a different law of war, it's a different law of occupation, it's a different moral code, okay? So even though we all know the conquest of America was violent and horrific, there were preachers who said, this is wrong. Actually, you can't treat people who have never heard about the religion, you can't make on war upon them just for being different. So that's a legal category called Indian. The other category is called is Muslim, from the Iberian Peninsula, and that is anyone who had contact with Christianity but decided, no, thank you. Those were people under Spanish law who could be made war against anyway. They could be enslaved, they could be made war upon. The problem with Ternate and Tidore is there were enough Spaniards and Portuguese who learned the language and learned about what these societies are, that they said exactly as you mentioned, that this is not Islam like we see in Morocco. This is not Islam like we see in Algeria next to Spain. This is very different. And then they saw that there were preachers and there were missionaries preaching Islam, but there were many people still in the 16th century who didn't practice Islam. And so the Spanish said, are these Muslims or are they Indians? And if you're an Indian, you had more rights under the Spanish. If you were a Muslim, you had fewer rights. And so they were completely confused in Maluku as to where these populations fell. Malucans found this out very quickly, by the way, and began using the word Indio a lot. We are Indians, we are not. So, your question is really interesting because it causes a problem for the Spanish to figure out who the Malucans are and how they're supposed to be brought into Spanish law. And finally, Christianity is a pretext for colonization. Yes, absolutely. It was a complete cover for conquest. And when the story of how the Spanish conquered Mexico got to Japan, the Japanese said, how did you manage to conquer that whole land of Mexico? And the Spanish said, oh, we did it by preaching the religion. And the shogun said, you're all out. Get out of Japan, right? We don't want this happening here. So that's one side. And finally, I know we're under time. The other part that you mentioned, though, is that colonized people did find pathways in the new religion to fight back. The entire story of Mexican history is a story of a people who had to convert to Christianity, a lot by force, but who found ideas of justice and equality. They found the Virgin Mary, who's very popular in Mexican religion, and they used these things to push the Europeans gradually out. So the story of Mexican history is a story of gradual struggle for freedom within that religion and pushing back. So that's another thing, is that people take what arrives and they rework it, and that's what's just fascinating. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, Ryan, Bu Harvia. Before I think this is about time to finish the discussions. But before that, I just want to give very short time to you and Pak Dedi to give like very short concluding remarks about these today's sessions, what things that need to be highlighted in our discussions. So first, probably to Pak Dedi dulu, silakan. Kemudian nanti ke Ryan. Silakan Pak Dedi.
Terima kasih.
Just very short.
I'm very interested to learn more about your project. Very interesting, and not only the subject but also the approach that you are using. So good luck, and looking forward to talk to you more this year and next. Mungkin itu aja, Mas Irawan.
Okay, terima kasih Pak Dedi. Your turn, Ryan. Yeah. Just very short.
Yes, of course. Terima kasih banyak to everybody. I appreciate your questions, your feedback. It helps me because there's so much I have to learn. And I hope to be in touch with you. If you have any questions, you can find me probably through Karim. Can share. I'm eager to learn from all of you, or to answer any questions you might have about things I've been talking about. So please stay in touch, and I will be back in Jakarta to give a presentation next summer and be in Indonesia for a long time. your questions will help me very much, and I might be in touch with you to get more advice as to how to learn more. So I'm just very grateful, happy to be here, and thank you so much again. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Ryan. Bapak dan Ibu, thank you very much for your questions, response, and also comments. It's very valuable for our discussions, making it robust. So, without further ado, I just want to close our today's sessions or discussions, and I want to return to Pak Karim. Thank you very much.
Ya, baik, terima kasih kepada Mas Irawan dan Pak Ryan, ya, Pak Ryan dan Pak Dedi yang telah mengisi kegiatan pada hari ini. Ya, kami pelaksana kegiatan diskusi pada hari ini mengucapkan banyak terima kasih juga kepada seluruh peserta yang masih bertahan pada diskusi ini. Dan sebelum kita menutup acara, mungkin lebih baik dibuka dulu ininya kameranya, karena untuk dokumentasi. Ya, saya akan memandu untuk dokumentasi. Silakan Ibu Bapak sekalian. Oke, di halaman pertama dulu ya. Ya, 1, 2, 3. Oke, kemudian di halaman kedua, dalam hitungan ketiga ya, 1, 2, 3. Oke, baik. Terima kasih Bu Bapak sekalian yang telah hadir pada hari ini. Mudah-mudahan kita bisa bertemu kembali dalam diskusi selanjutnya di sesi selanjutnya dalam forum diskusi budaya ataupun forum lain yang diadakan oleh Pusat Riset Masyarakat dan Budaya BRIN. Terakhir, terima kasih kepada Kepala Pusat Riset Masyarakat dan Budaya Ibu Aulia Hadi yang telah memberikan kesempatan kepada kami untuk melaksanakan kegiatan ini. Ya, saya tutup kegiatan pada hari ini dengan mengucapkan Alhamdulillahirrabbilalamin, dan untuk coffee break hanya ada di ruangan ini. Terima kasih. Ya, mungkin kalau yang di tempat lain ngopi di rumah masing-masing. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih banyak. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Pak
Terima
Dedi.
kasih semuanya.
Semuanya.